Welcome to the Weekly Dose Podcast, your one-stop shop for the weekly news in incretin mimetic therapies, with your host, ManOnMounjaro, Dave Knapp. Welcome to the Tuesday, July, if you can believe it, July 9th edition of the Weekly Dose Podcast. I'm your host, Dave Knapp, ManOnMounjaro. That's why I'm here. You are on the pen. That's why you're here. Wegovy, Saxenda, Victoza, Trulicity, Mounjaro, Zepbound, Caglarintide, Semaglutide, Survodutide, all the utides. That's what we talk about on this channel. We bring you the news for obesity medicine, type 2 diabetes medicine, and we thank you for being here. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we would love it if you would give it a 5-star rating and review wherever you get your podcast, whether it's Apple, Spotify, SoundCloud, wherever you get it. Drop it a 5-star rating and review. We'd love to get more ears on this podcast. If you want to get your eyes on this podcast, you can follow us along at OnThePen with Dave Knapp over on YouTube, where the video version of this is uploaded every week as well. Thank you, hat tip to Clark Kent, our producer for this podcast. Let's get right into the news. Right this week, we've got some amazing news on Ozempic. So a study done on semaglutide and reduction of cancer. Let's get into the reduction of cancer that this study, which will be linked in the show notes. Shout out to Madison Muller over at Bloomberg, who posted this amazing article, which got picked up everywhere. Check this out. This is amazing results from Ozempic, really now almost a generation old, considering that we have Mounjaro and Ozempic both on the market, Mounjaro being a newer version of an incretin mimetic drug. But we got a 65% reduced risk of gallbladder cancer, 63% reduced risk of meningioma, 59% reduced risk of pancreatic cancer, 53% reduced risk of a type of liver cancer called hepatocellular carcinoma, 48% reduced risk of ovarian cancer, 46% reduced risk of colorectal cancer, 41% reduced risk of multiple myeloma, 40% reduced risk of esophageal cancer, 26% reduced risk of endometrial cancer, and a 24% reduced risk of kidney cancer. That was a mouthful, but the long and short of it is less cancer for those being treated with semaglutide. And I think that'll be extrapolating out to the entire class of medications over time. You'll see that. But again, it's just like the good news doesn't stop with these medications and the clinical trials. Contrary to that, we did actually get one post-marketing study this past week on semaglutide that may link the use of semaglutide to a rare eye condition that causes sudden blindness. It's called NAION. We covered this in a couple videos, both on TikTok with a little bit more nuance, on YouTube where people have the attention span to actually get the nuance. But let's talk a little bit about this. So this is non-arteritic anterior ischemic optic neuropathy. Probably said that wrong. Doesn't matter. I'm just a layperson trying to read these big words that I think they make hard to pronounce so that it's obvious that I am a layperson when I'm talking about it. But let's talk about this. So this was a study that was done, again, post-marketing, which basically means it's a phase 4, I guess, technically. I don't know if it's a sanctioned trial by the FDA or not. I don't think that it is, but a post-marketing study where they let the drugs hit the market, right? They get approved by the FDA, they hit the market, and then after they hit the market, many studies are done to follow users of the medication. And they do this by monitoring electronic health records. So if you've ever logged into your MyChart, that's the one that my hospitals here locally use. And you get onto MyChart and you can get your whole medical chart, all the medications that you've been prescribed, all the things you've been diagnosed with, all those things live there. And so because they live there and because of the magic of AI and information data gathering, they're able to basically get post-marketing data really easy. And so this was one such study done in conjunction with Harvard Health. And it just basically found that people who were prescribed semaglutide, so it's important to note that these people, there's the only common denominator with semaglutide is that they had a prescription for it. We don't know if it was being filled. We don't have specific data on doses. So this is something that by the own designers of this trials or this data study admission needs more to be looked at, right? But basically what they said is for diabetics, there was a 4.2 times greater risk of developing this condition in patients that were prescribed semaglutide. For obese non-diabetic patients, researchers estimate that there was a 7.64 times greater risk of developing the condition for those who were prescribed semaglutide, which is interesting because this has long been associated with eye health, has long been associated with diabetes, not directly correlated with obesity to my knowledge, especially with the use of semaglutide. So it wasn't just people with diabetes, and I know that was the gut reaction to a lot of people. Well, diabetics always have issues with their eyes. In fact, researchers have seen in clinical trials, the actual FDA-sanctioned clinical trials, that semaglutide had higher rates of a different eye condition called diabetic retinopathy, and those studies are ongoing. But researchers are starting to believe that that issue is actually caused by a rapid decrease in blood sugar levels. So basically, a normalization of people's metabolic system, sort of contributing to that eye condition rather than the medication itself. But very interesting study. So the type 2 diabetes, obviously, as we talked about, and high blood pressure are risk factors for NAION. And it's possible that patients who have more severe diabetes, higher blood pressure, were more likely to be prescribed semaglutide. And this could be the bump in those numbers. But it is something that we want to always make you aware of, whether it's good news, bad news, indifferent news. We want you to be aware of the news so that you can have more competent and confident conversations with your medical provider when it comes to these medications. And so we did want to bring you the study. It'll be linked in the show notes, and hopefully they will take a closer look at this one to see if there is not only correlation, but causation, right? Because we ought to know that if that is the case. Moving on to the shortages of Mounjaro and Zepbound, they were updated by the FDA on the 2nd of July, so this past week. And basically what we saw is that the 7.5 milligram dose was removed from the shortage list. So that was the main change. So the 10 and 15 milligram doses remain of Zepbound and Mounjaro on the FDA shortage list. Now, on a TikTok video that I did that got several thousand views and hundreds of comments, if we're just looking at anecdotal responses, it sounded like people were actually having a pretty easy time finding their medication. The 12.5 did seem to be universally a little bit more challenging to get, but I even had people in the comments of that video saying that they had just been able to fill a 12.5 3-month supply. So there you go. Some people are able to get it. And so much of these shortages are definitely like regional, where people experience shortages in one area of the country and a plethora of drugs in the other area of the country. And it just tends to be how it works out with the supply chain. That's why I strongly recommend that you go over to Ro.co and use their supply tracker tool and just report it so that you can have good information for yourself. When you go to look for the medication and somebody else who's coming along behind you can get that information as well. The Mounjaro KwikPen launched in Australia. This is interesting news because we know that the KwikPen had already launched in the UK. One of the interesting things that we've learned about the KwikPen is it basically has a bonus dose in it, right? So all of our friends in the UK who've been making videos, they get their KwikPen in and they get to their 4th dose, and then they're like, there's enough liquid for a whole nother dose in here. Eli Lilly calls it a priming dose, right? What I've found with some investigating on this is basically, so the KwikPen was actually designed for Humalog, which holds a higher volume of liquid in it, right? And to get the fast track approval of this pen, this delivery mechanism, this presentation, as they call it in the industry, over in the UK, they had to use the same exact pen. So they couldn't go back to the drawing board and redesign a pen that had less liquid in it, and it requires that much liquid in it to work. So essentially, they call it the priming dose. But what users have found over in the United Kingdom is that it's basically a full dose. So basically, if you're in the UK, you get buy 4, get 1 free. Or if you're going by the United States numbers, it's like buy 1, get 6 free. Because we all know that system over there is a little bit more conducive to cheaper medications, but perhaps even a little bit more challenging to get over there. Talking about semaglutide versus tirzepatide, there was an interesting study that came out that sort of tracked weight loss for people with obesity in another real-world study. Like, again, this is a post-marketing study. This is a real-world study that takes patient data from these EMR, these electronic medical records programs, basically aggregates the data and says, here's what people's body weight did who were prescribed semaglutide over a period of time. This is what people who were prescribed tirzepatide did over time. And tirzepatide way outperformed semaglutide. So let's take a look. People who took semaglutide lost on average 3.6% of their body weight after 3 months, 5.8% after 6 months, and about 8.3% after 12 months. So after 12 months, 8.3% weight loss with semaglutide. It's about 8.3 pounds for every 100 pounds that somebody weighs were gone after 12 months. Those who took tirzepatide saw a greater percentage of body weight each month compared to semaglutide, an average of 5.9% after 3 months, 10.1% after 6 months, and 15.3% after 12 months. So almost twice as good in the real world. And it's interesting to take a look at these post-marketing real world studies because the clinical trial would have you believe that you can lose up to 22% of your body weight. But what we forget sometimes about those clinical studies is there was a titration period that everybody had to follow, and it was the same for everybody. There was a mix of female to male ratio in the clinical trials that may not exactly extrapolate out to real world data. I actually think there's probably way more women on it in the real world initially than maybe even in the clinical trials. And then the other thing is the fact that they were following strict diet and exercise protocols for the clinical trials that they were not required to obviously follow. Nobody's following you around in the real world, making sure that you subscribe to one diet or exercise plan than the other. So these are always the real, like, this is where the rubber meets the road with these medications. Which one edges the other one out? So this is another, again, post-marketing study. So it's not scientific the way that a clinical trial is, but it does show that tirzepatide is almost twice as effective from a weight loss standpoint. So fascinating news. Keto diet. So one of the things we've learned in a study on the long-term ketogenic diet is that it can cause hyperlipidemia, liver dysfunction, and glucose intolerance from impaired insulin trafficking and secretion in mice. So this is a really interesting data point that sort of, I think, from the keto community would get a lot of pushback, as at least initially ketogenic diets have really been shown to improve liver function by way of reducing fatty liver, right? The ketogenic diet for many people is pretty effective at reducing, at least up front, that liver fat that can basically lead to excess release of glucagon, which raises blood sugars and things like that. So very interesting. Obviously, hyperlipidemia, you talk about elevated cholesterol, triglycerides, all that stuff is kind of a no-brainer. You're just stuffing your face with cheese and meat and bacon. The science community goes back and forth on Twitter on this a lot. It's very interesting to see the keto zealots go back and forth with some of the obesity doctors who kind of think differently, and just to hear, how the keto community kind of defends the hyperlipidemia, saying that cholesterol and triglycerides are not as important as they once thought they were, where I think especially the cardiologists tend to come back at that and go, tell that to my patients on the operating table with, super high triglycerides and cholesterol. So that's an interesting one. Again, it'll be linked in the description of the show notes here. Make sure that you check out those links always, because Clark Kent goes to a lot of work to put these together for you so you can run them down. Talking about the high prices of GLP-1 medication, Senator Bernie Sanders and President Joe Biden published an opinion piece in the USA Today discussing the high prices of prescription prices charged in the U.S. In particular, they focused on Wegovy and Ozempic by Novo Nordisk. In the U.S., they also mentioned Eli Lilly's Mounjaro, but not Zepbound. So it's interesting to see that they did finally kind of talk to the fact that the Lilly medications are expensive as well. I think this is one of the reasons, maybe seeing this coming down the pike, why Lilly chose to launch Zepbound at a much cheaper price, 20% lower list price than Wegovy. Obviously, getting payers on board was part of that strategy too, but maybe perhaps seeing that ultimately you would have issues with the government looking at these and trying to figure out financially how they were going to afford adding these treatments to Medicare and government-sponsored health plans, and kind of do that in a sustainable way. They had to know that eventually they were going to end up in the crosshairs, and potentially that was, going to be their defense. Hey, we came in 20% lower than the other drug on the market, so we are the heroes, right? So very interesting sort of take. So really, really great news roundup this week from Clark Kent. Thank you for being such a resource to the OnThePen community. Another shout out to you. He doesn't like the hat tips, but I got to give them to him because he does such a great job bringing this news to us every week. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider giving it a 5-star rating and review. If you're not a member on the YouTube channel, of course, you get the video of this podcast. Comes out a couple days typically before the rest of the world gets to see it. So there's a little plug for becoming a member. The link is in the description. But until next week, there will be much more news to discuss. Sorry, you lost me there for a second. And I look forward to doing it. But until next week, we'll see you on the pen.